Few days ago, just in the run-up to Easter, Christianity Today published an article by one of their senior news editors. His name is Daniel Silliman, in which he explored this idea defended by a historian that Jesus, in fact, was not nailed to the cross, but rather was tied by ropes to the cross. This quickly elicited a very sharp reply from Christians everywhere who pointed out that the Gospel of John describes Thomas as coming up to Jesus and seeing the nail scars in his hands, which would imply that that was false. This resulted in a mea culpa of sorts just posted on Christianity Today magazine's website from Daniel Silliman. Let's take a look. Okay, so he writes this article, nailing down the truth of Christ's crucifixion, apologizing for what I got wrong, reporting on an idiosyncratic view on how Jesus died. So we scroll down. Oh, do not need that. Scroll down. And he said that his curiosity had been piqued by this article in Biblical Archaeology Review exploring this idiosyncratic view that Jesus was tied up with ropes rather than nails. He thought that was interesting. He discussed that in the article. But he says this is pretty revealing. I didn't think about John 20:25 and the implication of the idea that Thomas was mistaken to think the resurrected Jesus would have nail marks in his hands. In essence, he didn't explore or acknowledge the fact that this view that Jesus was tied up with ropes would be questioning the historicity of this pericope in the Gospel of John where Jesus meets Thomas. Fair enough. And I agree. And this is the thing that's interesting, however, to me, and the thing that I want to highlight. Well, actually, two things. The first thing is let's give props to Mr. Silliman for acknowledging that he overlooked this biblical verse, which is a pretty bold thing to overlook. But mistakes do happen. Props to him for that. This is what intrigues me though about this, and this is why I wanted to talk about it and highlight it here. He says this at the end. My article implicitly called into question the inerrancy of Scripture. In my eagerness to explore the historical context of Christ's death, I missed that, and I'm sorry. This is really interesting to me. So, what Silliman is saying here is the problem isn't just that he was questioning the historicity of the pericope in the Gospel of John. The problem was that he was questioning the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. Now, he doesn't define biblical inerrancy here, but it seems pretty clear that he's assuming that biblical inerrancy includes a commitment to the historical accuracy of all historical narratival descriptions in the Bible, I guess, something like that. So for Silliman, the real issue isn't simply that in the Gospel of John, the encounter between Thomas and Jesus is not only theologically important, which certainly is, but it's also apologetically important. It provides this eyewitness encounter, confirms that the same body that was laid in the tomb has now been raised because we have the same identifying marks of crucifixion on the resurrection body. That's significant. So, as a historical witness, that's very important. Theologically, then, that attests to the historical resurrection. For Silliman, questioning the narrative, the pericope itself, is not the primary error or sin or indiscretion of his article. Rather, questioning the general doctrine of biblical inerrancy about historical reports contained in the Bible is the chief error or sin of the article. And I just think that that is wrong. I think that that is mistaken. I think that shows an inversion of priorities in which the dogmatic commitment to some particular understanding of biblical inerrancy takes precedence over the recognition of the theological importance of this specific text. Let me put it another way. Not every historical denial is as important as every other. There's this whole question about, for example, two different accounts seemingly of how Judas died, either that he was hanged or that he fell and that his bowels spilled out. And there's a famous harmonization of these two seemingly distinct accounts of how Judas Iscariot died. And what you say is, well, he was hanged, the rope broke, and then his bowels spilled out. And that's possible, but it's also possible that we have two different accounts of how Judas Iscariot died, and one of them is in error, unless you are committed a priori to a particular understanding of biblical inerrancy in which every apparent contradiction, either internal to the text or with external data from the text, needs to be reconciled, lest that doctrine of inerrancy be questioned. And that is a dogmatism that concerns me because, among other things, it inverts priorities. The death of Judas Iscariot is not nearly as important as a resurrection account of Jesus Christ. So, to question some aspect of the historicity of one or both of the accounts of the death of Judas Iscariot is not theologically or apologetically weighty in anything comparable to questioning the presentation of Jesus to Thomas in the Gospel of John. They're just two different things. But the fact that Silliman says the primary issue here, the primary concern, the primary indiscretion was violating this particular doctrine of biblical inerrancy means that both of these are treated as equal indiscretions. I've questioned the historicity of the death of Judas. I've questioned the historicity of the visible post-resurrection presentation of Jesus to Judas Iscariot. Both of the, or sorry, Judas Iscariot, Jesus to Thomas. Both of those are equivalent errors. They are both breaches of biblical inerrancy. And that, to my mind, is shows the theological distortion that comes when you place this particular doctrine of biblical inerrancy as sliding it into the creedal confessions as somehow that is a requirement rather than to have a first order reflection on what the creed commits us to and then to look at the relative historical importance of that within the biblical text. In other words, creed commits us to the death and resurrection of Jesus, not to the particular death of Judas Iscariot. So, based upon the creed as the guide rather than biblical inerrancy, a dogmatic commitment as the guide, what we would say is it's not equivalent to question the historicity of Judas Iscariot versus the post resurrection appearances of Jesus. So, that's something that stood out to me with Silliman here is I think he was wrong. I think the evidence on the balance supports that Jesus was crucified with nails. And I think it is weighty to question the historicity of the presentation of Jesus to Thomas in the Gospel of John. But I wouldn't say the primary error here was questioning biblical inerrancy. The primary error is questioning a doctrine which could have all sorts of theological ramifications for the key confession of Christian faith, which is the historical resurrection of Jesus.